Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Story 1. Language of the Unknown.
When I was a teenager, my mother sent me to the Philippines for school and to reconnect with my culture. She arranged for me to stay with my aunts for a while. My family was deeply religious. We held Bible studies, attended Sunday school, and never missed a church service. One of my aunts was a pastor who worked closely with missionaries from around the world. We lived on an American missionary campus surrounded by century-old buildings, offices, churches, and guest houses. Our home had once been an office before being converted into an apartment. The walls were thin, barely soundproof, allowing every sound to travel through them. My aunt was strict and forbade me from dating. However, I was secretly seeing a boy whose family lived on the floor above us. He was a pastor's son, and like me, he had a rebellious streak. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, he would sneak downstairs and we would talk for hours through my window, whispering in hushed voices. One night, I wanted to ensure my aunt was asleep before meeting him. I pressed a glass against the wall to listen for any movement. Instead of silence, I heard murmurs. Two distinct female voices engaged in conversation. Curious, I put the glass down and pressed my ear directly against the wall. The voices became clearer, definitely two women speaking, but something was strange. I could not understand a single word. I spoke Tagalog fluently, and in our household we only used English or Tagalog. But this was neither. The language was foreign, unfamiliar, low, rhythmic, and unsettling. It sent chills through me, resonating through the wall in a way that felt almost otherworldly. It reminded me of Latin, but darker, more hypnotic. A strange unease settled over me. After a few minutes, I texted my boyfriend and told him not to come down that night. Something did not feel right. Then, something even stranger happened. The next morning, I went about my usual routine and waited for my aunt to emerge for her morning coffee. But she never did. Confused, I asked my other relatives, only to be told that she had left for a conference the morning before. She had not been home the previous night. I felt my entire body freeze. That room had been empty. No one had been there. Goosebumps prickled my skin as I replayed the voices in my head. Who or what had I been listening to? To this day, I have no explanation. I do not know what language it was, where the voices came from, or who they belonged to. And honestly, I am not sure I want to know.
Story 2. The Ghost That Prowled at Night.
At my old apartment, I had a nightly encounter with what I am certain was the ghost of a cat. It began when I first caught a glimpse of it running past me in the corner of my eye. It was unmistakably a cat. Its swift, graceful movement and the way it disappeared in an instant sent a shiver down my spine. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light or my imagination. But then, the experiences became more frequent. One night, as I was lying in bed, I felt something jump onto the mattress. The weight was small but distinct, pressing lightly against the fabric. Then came the sensation of little steps moving around my legs, slowly making their way up towards my chest. The air around me grew noticeably colder, as if something unseen was drawing closer. I know that sounds like a common ghostly occurrence, but I could genuinely feel it, an almost imperceptible presence, as if it were breathing beside me. This became a nightly experience. The feeling of unseen paws padding around, the shift in temperature, the weight pressing down on the bed, each encounter more vivid than the last. One night, I awoke suddenly, feeling an unnatural pressure on my chest. In the dim light of the room, I could make out a shadowy form sitting perfectly still. I could not move. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. Just as I became fully conscious, the shape seemed to notice me. In an instant, it leaped off, vanishing into thin air before my eyes. These encounters continued for months. Every night, the ghostly feline would return, moving unseen yet undeniably present. It never felt malicious, just lingering, a lost presence seeking comfort in a home that no longer remembered it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The night I moved out was the last time I ever felt it. I never saw, heard, or sensed it again. To this day, I wonder, was it a memory of a pet long gone, or something else entirely?
Story 3. The Haunting on the Line.
A few days ago, I was on the phone with my daughter, having a normal conversation when something chilling happened. As we were chatting, I suddenly heard a voice say, "Get off." It was not just a whisper. It was clear, firm, and commanding, almost as if someone was standing right next to her. At first, I thought it was my son-in-law. The voice sounded exactly like him. Thinking he might be having a bad day, I laughed a little and told my daughter, "Wow, he is grumpy today." But my daughter paused, confused. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I hesitated, suddenly unsure. "Do you need to get off the phone? He just told you to hang up." Now she sounded genuinely unsettled. "Mum, what do you mean?" He did not say anything. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I just heard him. He said, "Get off," really clearly. Silence. Then she spoke again, her voice now uneasy. "Mum, my husband is right here, sitting next to me in the car. The phone is on speaker." We did not hear anything. A deep, unsettling chill spread through me, but it sounded exactly like him. I expected her to laugh it off, maybe tell me they were messing with me, but instead she sounded worried. "Mum, you are scaring me. Are you sure you are okay?" I sat there gripping the phone tightly, my mind racing. I had been so convinced it was a prank, but her reaction made it clear it was not. And the voice I heard, it had not come from my son-in-law. A strange sensation settled in my chest, a mixture of unease and dread. Who or what had spoken those words? And why did it sound exactly like someone familiar? I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was a glitch, an auditory hallucination, or maybe interference in the call. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was not alone in that moment. Something else was there, and it wanted me to know.
Story 4. The voice said he is touching you.
I have always felt that I was not alone in my house. Shadows move where they should not, whispers echo in empty rooms, and the air always seems charged with something unseen. Lately, I decided to communicate with whatever lingers here. One night, I was watching a gameplay video of the intruder on Roblox. In the game, the power suddenly went out, plunging the screen into darkness. At that exact moment, my spirit communication device lit up with a message. "It's bright." My breath caught. I had not spoken aloud, yet something had responded. A moment later, another message appeared. "Dark." A chill ran down my spine. Trying to shake the unease, I reached for my television remote. Instantly, my device flashed. "Press." The timing was too perfect. I hesitated, then switched to something more comforting, an Animal Crossing long play. A few seconds later, I received a new message. "What's this?" I swallowed hard and answered aloud, explaining the game. My device responded almost immediately. "Please continue." They were watching with me. Curious, I asked for a name. The screen glitched slightly before displaying. I told him. My hands tightened around my blanket. The night before, I had received another eerie message. "He is touching you." Who was he? I asked again, but the only response I received was, "Why?" I explained that I wanted to connect, to understand. There was a long pause before the device flickered with "later this evening." As the hours stretched on, more words appeared. Lisa, then drowned. My chest tightened. Just earlier, I had received the words, the grave. We live near a creek and a lake. Had Lisa drowned there? I tried to distract myself, showing the spirits my colorful hair clips. A response flashed. No way. The tone felt excited, almost playful, but beneath that, something still felt wrong. Who was he? And why did Lisa seem so eager to talk about him? Tonight, I will ask again, but a small voice in my head whispers that maybe I should not.
Story 5. My childhood friend was not human.
When I was 6 years old, I had a friend no one else could see. She was a woman dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, her face pale, her eyes always filled with sorrow. But to me, she was simply my friend. She would play with me during the day, whispering stories and watching as I colored in my books. At night, she would stand by my bed. I never found it strange. She was always there, her silhouette barely visible in the dim glow of my nightlight. I would drift off to sleep, feeling comforted, as if I were never truly alone. As I grew older, the games changed. She no longer just watched. She began to speak. Her voice was soft, almost like a lullaby, but it always carried a trace of sadness. "You are such a good girl," she would say, gently brushing my hair. "You remind me so much of my little one." I never questioned her words. I thought of her as a guardian, a presence that had always belonged in my life. But then, the dreams started. I would wake up, gasping for air, the sensation of cold hands gripping my arms. In my dreams, I was sinking, water filling my lungs, a woman's voice screaming a name I did not recognize. One night, I finally asked her, "Who are you?" She looked at me with wide, sorrowful eyes and whispered, "I lost my child, but then I found you." A shiver ran through me. Something in the air had changed. The warmth I once felt had turned into something possessive, something desperate. I started to notice other things. My bedroom door would creak open in the middle of the night. My toys would move when I was not looking. Sometimes I would hear quiet humming right beside my ear. The final night I saw her, she stood closer than ever before. Her face was no longer sad, but hollow, empty. Her voice came in a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Do not leave me like she did." That was the night my family moved away. But sometimes in the silence of my new home, I still hear her humming.
Story 6. A midnight encounter with a silent specter.
I was abruptly woken up in the dead of night, my heart racing and my breath shallow. There, standing right over me, was the figure of a heavy person. They were tall and shadowy, their form barely visible in the dark. All I could hear was a soft, persistent shush, as if they were trying to calm me down. It was eerie, the sound cutting through the silence of the room, each shush growing more unsettling with each passing moment. I was frozen in place, my eyes wide open but unable to move. It felt like my body was trapped in some kind of invisible force, unable to react. The figure didn't seem to have any features, just an overwhelming presence standing over me, breathing in the cold, damp air of the room. I could feel the weight of their presence, like a suffocating pressure pressing down on my chest. "Shush," the figure whispered again, and this time, the sound felt like it was coming from deep within my very soul. I wanted to scream, to shout, but I couldn't. I could only lay there, trying to hold on to my sanity, desperately wishing for it to stop. My mind screamed for me to do something, anything, but my body refused to obey. Suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that when I opened them again, the figure would be gone. I slowly, painfully, opened my eyes. There was nothing. The figure was gone. The room was completely still, eerily quiet, with not a sound to be heard. My heart raced as I tried to process what had just happened. Had I been dreaming, or had I truly encountered something supernatural? The room was empty, and yet the silence lingered, thick and suffocating. It felt like something was still there, watching me, waiting for me to slip into another moment of weakness. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still very much present, lurking in the shadows of my mind. The quiet was no longer peaceful, it was ominous, like a warning.
Story 7. The 1850s House.
When I was almost 13, my family and I moved to a remote country town. My mum had purchased an old house, built in the 1850s, which had been passed down from generation to generation. We were the first family to buy it from the original owners, and the moment we stepped inside, we were drawn to it. There was something about the air, something almost tangible about the house. It felt like it was waiting for us. As the removalists finished their work, we stood in the middle room, a large, dusty space with peeling wallpaper and creaky wooden floors. Suddenly, without any warning, all the doors in the house slammed shut, one by one, so forcefully that the sound echoed throughout the entire place. The removalist, who had been joking just moments before, turned pale and whispered under his breath, "They've got you now." It should have been terrifying, but instead it felt strangely comforting, almost as if the house were enveloping us in a warm, protective embrace. We laughed it off, thinking it was just an old house settling, but deep down, a strange sense of peace washed over us. The kind of peace you only find in a place that feels like home. For the next few years we lived there, and despite its age, it never felt eerie or uncomfortable. But there were moments when things didn't quite add up. I would often hear soft whispers late at night, as if someone was speaking just outside my door, but when I opened it, no one would be there. My little brother would claim to have seen shadows moving across the hallway, and the family dog would occasionally bark at nothing, growling at empty corners of the house. Then, when we had to move to a larger property for our growing hobby farm, something strange happened. The night before we left, I went to say goodbye to the house. As I stood in the middle room once again, the doors slammed shut around me, one by one, just like the first time. Only this time, they stayed shut. The air grew heavy, and the silence was overwhelming. It was as if the house didn't want us to leave. Despite the fear creeping up my spine, I couldn't help but smile. The house wasn't haunted in the way people think. It was more like a guardian spirit, always watching, always waiting, but never malicious. I'll always miss that house and its welcoming spirits, even though I know we had to leave. Some places, some spirits, just never let go.
Story 8. The light switch that would not stay off.
A few weeks ago, we were called in to investigate a client's home after she reported a series of strange, unsettling occurrences. She lived alone, and while she was never outright terrified, she couldn't ignore the unnerving events happening in her house. The lights would flicker on and off at random, items would be moved from their original places, and doors would swing open without explanation. Her description of these events was enough to send chills down anyone's spine, but 3 prior checks of the home had yielded no signs of any disturbance. We thought it might be a simple electrical issue, or maybe a few misplaced items. But on the 4th visit, things took a darker turn. As we stood in the living room discussing the case, something strange happened. The light switch on the wall flicked off by itself. We all turned to look, thinking perhaps it had been a draft or some mechanical failure. But the moment we stepped closer, the air grew thick with an odd, heavy silence. It was then that the temperature in the room dropped. so sharply that we could see our breath in the air. The walls seemed to close in on us, and an overwhelming feeling of dread swept over the room. As we reached for the light switch, it turned back on its own accord. We looked at each other in disbelief. This wasn't a malfunction. It was something far more sinister. The lights continued to flicker, on off, each flicker echoing louder and louder, until it sounded like thunder in the distance. Suddenly, the client's voice trembled from behind us. "I told you," she whispered. "It never leaves. It's always watching." The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, began to echo from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. But there was no one there. We were trapped in the grip of something unseen, something that had been there long before us. That night, the house wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, and the lights weren't just switching on and off. They were trying to tell us something.
Story 9. The Shadow with the Glowing Eye.
When I was in 5th grade, I experienced something that still haunts me to this day. It was a late night, and I was having trouble sleeping, which wasn't common for me back then. My mum always had a nightlight outside my room and my brother's, just by the door to the computer room, where my dad kept his work stuff. I went to bed trying to settle in, but something was off that night. I turned onto my back, and that's when I saw it. There, standing just outside the door to the computer room, was a tall, dark figure, almost like a shadow, but it wasn't the same as anything I'd ever seen before. It leaned out from the room, and I could feel its cold, unsettling gaze fixed directly on me. Its left eye, it glowed green, like something out of a nightmare. That glowing green eye pierced the darkness, unblinking, watching me, sending chills down my spine. I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed, not like sleep paralysis though, because I could feel the weight of my body, and I was fully awake. I immediately turned over, burying my head under my pillow, trying to shut out the horrifying sight, praying it would just go away. My heart pounded in my chest, as if it could hear me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then, when I finally gathered the courage to look back, the figure was gone, vanished into the air, like it was never there at all. For years I convinced myself it was just a bad dream, maybe even an early experience with sleep paralysis. But when I started having actual sleep paralysis episodes later on, they were different. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, but the memories of that night didn't fit into those experiences. This felt real. It felt like something else, something alive, something watching me. I've heard of shadow people before, but none of them had a glowing eye, especially not green. To this day, I have no idea what that thing was, but the memories linger. I've shared this with my mum and friends, jokingly calling it the boogeyman, but deep down, I still wonder what was it that watched me that night.
Story 10. The Woman by the Water.
Last weekend, my wife and I took our 2 sons and my oldest son's girlfriend camping deep in the woods for the weekend. The first 2 nights were fun, full of laughter and stories around the campfire. But on the last night, something happened that we could never explain. In the middle of the night, I woke up with an unsettling feeling, as if something was off. I noticed both of my sons weren't in their tents. I called out their names, and to my surprise, they were ahead on the trail, walking as if drawn by some unseen force. They told me they too felt the urge to go out. My wife and my son's girlfriend were still sleeping in their tents, and we were a little ways down the trail, heading toward the water, which was about half a mile ahead. As we walked, talking quietly, I began hearing faint voices. My sons heard it too, distant whispers on the breeze, growing louder as we neared the water's edge. When we arrived, we saw her, sitting by the water, her clothes tattered, her hair unkempt and her face streaked with dirt. The young woman, maybe in her late teens or early 20s, was crying softly. I approached her, asking if she needed help. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow, and whispered something in a language I couldn't understand. And just as I blinked, she vanished, disappearing into thin air. My son saw it too, and we stood there, shaken, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I'm a skeptic, so I tried to convince myself it wasn't paranormal, but deep down, I couldn't explain what we witnessed. The next morning, we packed up early and left, still disturbed by the strange encounter. But when we got home, things took a darker turn. The house felt unnaturally cold, even though the thermostat read 75 degrees. Our dog was jumpy, growling at empty corners. Later that week, my son's girlfriend screamed in the night. She had seen the same girl, standing by his bed, staring at him before vanishing. We haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us home from that night by the water.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.